In today's video, I will be interviewing Laura Farris. Laura is the local MP for Newbury and has been a great supporter of mine. I've received many letters from Laura and had the honour to speak to her around the work I do for autism. Today we speak about what employers and government could be doing around autism to improve the 21% to 22% of autistic people in full-time work statistic, and we also speak about what schools could be doing to improve the support and diagnoses of autistic people. Hey everyone, welcome to another video of MaxiAspie for the special series The Autism Connections, and today I'm joined by the local MP of Newbury, Laura Farris. Laura, thank you for obviously coming on and agreeing to do an interview.
It's a great pleasure.
I always start off with the episode of asking, what is your connection to autism?
Well, I suppose I have an informal connection to autism in that a very close friend of mine has an autistic daughter, and I suppose I was with her through that journey when her daughter was first presenting, when she was first referred, when they received the diagnosis, and how they've managed that through her daughter's early years. So I have that informal connection to it. And also it is something that a lot of parents have written to me about since I've been the MP here in the last 2 years, again in relation to children primarily, and about the length of time they've had to wait in getting diagnoses through their local CAM service, and what effect that's had on their children, who are usually in mainstream school settings or struggling in mainstream school settings. So waiting times and not being able to access, first of all not getting the diagnosis that they need through CAMs, and then not having the right support in place while that delay is going on, is something that I've dealt with professionally quite a lot.
Yeah, because I think the average age for a diagnosis, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's 4 years old. But obviously with the pandemic and everything that's happened, the services are obviously under the most pressure they've ever been.
I mean, I'm going to be honest with you, the parents who write to me tend to have children a bit older than that, but it is mainly primary school age, not always just primary school age, but that is the main group. The West Berkshire CAM service has had significant problems with delays well before the pandemic, actually, and it is one of the big health issues actually in this fifth part of the world, I'm afraid to say.
Yeah, I mean, I always remember, obviously, one of the best pieces of work I ever did was with the National Autistic Society, and getting to work with government to raise the understanding of autism, especially around employment.
Yeah.
Because at the time, only thought it was 16% of people in full-time work who were autistic, and then the government obviously recognised the campaign that we did and decided we're going to start taking amount of these numbers of autistic people, and then the ONS came out and said just earlier last year that there was only 21% of autistic people in any kind of work.
Yeah.
It's obviously, that's sort of how
I had understood that to be 21% in full-time work, but you may be correct.
That's exactly how I thought, and it was only till I spoke to the National Autistic Society, because I had to confirm the figure, because I was making videos going, the figure's gone up, and everyone was like, oh, okay, and then I spoke to the National Autistic Society, and it's like, no, that's any kind of work.
Okay.
So I was obviously even more like, that's massively, it's massively away from what we even thought it was to what it is now. Obviously you took office after Richard Benyon, and I know, for instance, you have done a lot for employment. I think you passed a bill last year in October around employment and making sure that people wasn't hiring people and then firing them and rehiring them again.
Oh yeah, well that's still a piece of work that's going on, but I think in terms of autism and employment, if I could sort of go back to the start, I think you're right to say that it's it's certainly an area of government focus, but that's relatively recent, I would say.
Yeah.
And I think it's come into much sharper focus in the last 3 to 5 years. We have quite significant announcements about how public money is going to be spent, things like the spending review and the budget. They're just titles of things where Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, sets out how he's going to spend the public purse. And the kind of money that's going into SEN, both at educational and training level, is always part of that announcement, and it's always separately described, because I think there's a recognition that part of the issue is about investment. But I think another part of where we're developing well is in our understanding, and certainly from the families that I've worked with in my constituency, I know that if you can get a diagnosis for your child, then that diagnosis says that they're autistic, and then you can get the right interventions. You may not be able to achieve the perfect educational kind of pathway for them, but you can make a significant difference, a really significant difference, as to how they will develop through school, and then their chances of going on to further or higher education, or into the workplace, and hopefully all of those things. And I think also our understanding of spectrum conditions has changed a lot, because autism is a spectrum condition, like frankly many others. But there are, if for example autism is severe and it's bound up with many other special educational needs, that may be a more challenging case than somebody who is autistic at a different end of the spectrum, where the interventions are going to make a radical difference. So I think the language that we use in Parliament and in society has changed a lot, and I definitely think that autism has gone from being seen, probably when I was a kid, as a problem that you had to manage, to potential that can be realised if you have the right systems in place. I don't know if that's something that you would agree with.
No, absolutely. I mean, I remember growing up at school, and it was, I think you're absolutely right with the language, because I think even medical professionals still use ASD, and it's autism spectrum disorder. Yeah. And it's that sort of language. It's like, well, to us, it's not a disorder. We are neurodiverse.
Yes.
We think differently.
Yes.
And who's to say that the way that we think is the wrong way?
Well, actually, there's a really important point there. Isn't it the case that more Nobel Prize winners have got some, or like this there's an extraordinarily high correlation of people who've won Nobel Prizes who also would have some form of autism.
Yeah, so if you
and isn't there also a creativity? I was in a debate in Parliament recently where we were talking about neurodiversity, and it was another MP who was making these points. But if you look at also the creativity in like famous artists and people whose brains basically work in a slightly different way, and where they've succeeded, and again it was where autism kind of flourishes. Yeah. And I think that is, again, I think it's something where our public understanding of this stuff is developing in a positive way, I think.
I think awareness is all the way up, and I think even if you look back to into the 60s to now, the level of understanding has
massively, even from the 80s or 90s. I think it's changed a lot.
I mean, for yourself, what do you think could speed up, for instance, the diagnosis stage? What do you think the key elements are of, I suppose, parents having barriers? Because
that's a good question. Okay, so what I think actually should happen is, I think there should be some ability to diagnose in school. I think that because CAM services, the only one I really know about, just for anyone who's watching and isn't familiar with that shorthand, it's Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services. I only can really speak for West Berkshire because it's the area that I represent and the only one that I know well, but they have two limbs to what they do. One is mental health in the sense of teenagers who are depressed, or younger children too, but it is probably primarily secondary school age kids, with things like depression and all the kind of complex things, for example anorexia or self-harming. There is a lot of that. And then the second pathway is special educational needs. And I have wondered for a long time whether special educational needs could at least partly be removed from camps and come into schools. And when a parent has a young child who is exhibiting certain behaviours that suggest ADHD or perhaps autism, and they're not sure that diagnosis could happen in a school setting, so that the school has a much easier pathway to start putting in the right mitigations. And I also think that early intervention for children with any of those things, and it's not just those two. I mean, there's obviously a complex range of special educational needs, but we do speak that language much more fluently now, and we are much more aware of what that might look like. And I think early diagnosis in the school setting, working with the school and getting interventions in place would make a significant difference.
A lot of the speeches I obviously do when I go to schools to talk, and I think as well the National Autistic Society released a report that said, I can't remember the exact figure, but it was definitely over 60%. But it was something along the lines of a lot of teachers feel that they don't have the adequate training to provide help for people with special educational needs. And it was very hard, it was very difficult, I think, for myself growing up, because my mum had to fight to get a diagnosis. Fortunately, I was very lucky. I got a statement before, and then I was diagnosed at the age of 6 when I was at primary school. But a lot of the teachers didn't understand. I probably had 2 or 3 teachers that understood me. I mean, and I always say the key to understanding autism is understanding the individual. And these teachers just really understood me. But when I went to my secondary school, which had had an ASD unit in there, I think I was there 2 years, and then I was moved out of the school. And what I've also read is that schools aren't actually allowed to exclude people with special educational needs, but yet they do it in a form of managed move. So they basically say, oh, we think you'll be better somewhere else. This is going into a question, by the way, I don't want you to think I'm rambling on.
No.
Obviously, I then went to a special educational needs school, and even though the environment was quite hostile at times, just because there was a complexity of people that had conditions, had traumatic events in their life, so it could be quite a hostile, volatile place, to be in. There could be like 7 fights a day in the classroom, and I'd just be sat there thinking, what environment am I sort of in? But the support that school gave was second to none. The education suffered, I'd say, a little bit because, hey, that's the environment that we were in. I suppose the question is, though, if we've got teachers that feel that they're not getting the adequate training, I suppose that's something that would have to be massively pushed first from the government, from schools. So in order for people to get the qualification to diagnose people, in order to take it away from the CAMS facility.
Well, I think you've made a good point, which is that once you've got the diagnosis, what kind of service is provided to the child and to the family, and I think it is really variable between schools. And again, I have heard that from parents who've written to me, and some have told me about local schools where they felt their child was very well supported, and others have said almost exactly the opposite of that. So I think, I'm probably not sufficiently expert enough in education to know whether it's about having all teachers trained or more specialist teachers trained who provide a supporting function within the classroom. But I do think it is true to say that it's too patchy, the way that we are providing for special educational needs. And I think actually it's envisaged that some of the funding, which I said is being announced sort of in these various things, will go to trying to standardise the quality of support we can give, number one. And then the other thing that you said that I have to pick up on is you said that your mum had to fight. And I'm afraid to say I still think that's the experience of parents.
I think it's worse. I mean, when I spoke to my mum the other day, I think in the whole it took, I think I was on the waiting list for 8 months. And I think the waiting list now is like over 2 years.
Yeah, that's true. It is over 2 years. And that's just the start of the battle. So yes, I think that sadly, the experience of parents having to fight is familiar. It's still going on, and it's something that I brought a debate in Parliament on it about a month ago to talk about this issue, because it's a really big problem in this constituency, maybe elsewhere too, because actually it was a well-attended debate and people from all over the country were talking about it.
Do you get the sense of, even when people get the diagnosis, they're still sort of, how do I word it? I won't say let down, but they still necessarily don't get the support and the help that they deserve?
I think that So I think a little bit, that patchiness that I was talking about, because I have to be honest, some parents did say that once the child had the diagnosis and they knew what they were dealing with, that they did get the support and others didn't. But the one thing I do think that was important about the diagnosis, two things actually, which seem to be a consistent view, is that it was helpful for a child who may have felt, for example, that they weren't making friends easily or they weren't getting on through school easily, to know what they had.
Yeah.
That so sort of self-knowledge was important. And the other thing was, and that applied actually to the family too, it was helpful for them to know what they were dealing with. And then I think the schools said pretty much the same thing, the secondary schools that I communicated with, because they said, you know, even though we can sort of see that a child is probably a SEND child before we've had the diagnosis, we're still not putting in place the right support really until we actually know. And there are different pathways for different special educational needs. So for the school, the statement and the diagnosis, well, you know, they're kind of two halves of the same whole, help the school to do the right thing. And for the child, it's the self-knowledge.
I think acceptance is key.
Yeah.
And a lot of parents do battle with, you know, labels and diagnosis.
Yeah,
Because
they do.
some cry for it and then some just don't want it at all.
Yeah, that's true actually, yeah.
And, you know, I always say, I don't know, my mum obviously always cried for a diagnosis because she just wanted that help, that support, and she wanted me to know that, you know what, when I was in class and I thought, oh, why am I not as smart as the other kids, or, you know, why can't I make any friends? Not that the autism was an excuse, but there was a reason as to why I was struggling to learn it. And when I found out I had my conditions, I think it motivated me a lot more. It pushed me to work harder. I mean, I left school with no GCSEs, you know, so, you know, just because my school didn't do them. And it motivated me to be like, well, I need to work extra hard then if I want to get somewhere.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, working with the National Autistic Society and everything else, you don't want to be another statistic. You don't want to. No. You want to make that change, and you want to show people that actually you can do it. It's tough and it's hard, and unfortunately life is. It's even harder when, because people always say to me, if autism is not a disorder, what is it? Because, you know, it's affecting the way that you learn things. It affects how you process things. But I always say, it's a different way of thinking. It doesn't mean it's right or wrong, but unfortunately the world around us is very much configured for neurotypical people. You know? So my mum always said, you know, your brain works like this, but other people's brain works like this. Yeah. And unfortunately the world that we live in is like this. And that's what makes it hard, because you just have to conform and adapt and, you know, sometimes learn things the hard way. I suppose with the diagnosis and schools, where do you think, for instance, employers need to improve that statistic of that 21%? What do you think government could do alongside employees to maybe encourage employers to actually see the potential in autistic people and not see it as, oh, well, I don't want to hire them in case, you know, they're not any good, or they're not going to be a good worker?
The thing is that, you know, it's a really good question that I don't really have the answer to, but can I just tell you what I think? Well, first of all, people with autism do have protection under the Equality Act.
Yeah.
And they don't have to declare that they're autistic when they apply for a job.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether the issue is getting the job in the first place, or that they're not managing to retain employment, and that that employers are not making sufficient maybe adjustments that would say, well, this is someone who's performing unreliably, or, you know, whatever, that it doesn't fit in. And I would like to see more data as to what actually the pathway for a young autistic person who has completed school, and also whether there's a lagging factor. So as I say, I think we've improved a lot in the last, you know, over recent years, whether the more young autistic people who are going through school with some qualifications and so on are still finding it hard in the workplace, or whether it's a function of the fact that some don't have any qualifications, which immediately makes it more difficult in the workplace. So I would have to say that I don't have enough data. There is existing protection of the Equality Act, And I think I'd have to give more thought actually really to how we can put in place strategies that will actually have a positive effect getting young autistic people into work.
Yeah.
And staying in work actually, because as I say, sometimes you find that, particularly with any kind of disability or special educational need, the problem isn't getting the job, it's keeping the work.
I think like for me, if I was to look at it from a whole, just from the people I've spoken to and the work I've done with the National Autistic Side, Dimensions UK, I think one of the biggest stumbling blocks is obviously autistic people go through school, they get some, not all, but some people go through school, don't necessarily get the support that they need. At 16, CAMS just stops, and that's their sort of bit of help that they had is now gone. It's like, here's the big wide world, get on with it, and you just sort of thrown into this.
What do you think about things like mentoring, and do you think that's a positive thing?
Absolutely. I think if you had someone who has been on a similar journey to you, or is autistic, or just a companion, someone to talk to, I think it's so key.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of autistic people just don't want to do things on their own for the first time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember getting a bus for the first time and just thinking, you know, I remember getting my full job and I said to my mum, I said, I'm not getting the bus. She said, well, I'm going to take her. And my mum was quite stern in that way because she knew that I needed to do things in life, otherwise I wouldn't get to where I wanted to get. So she put her foot down quite a lot and said, well, no, if you want to do that, you do it.
You've got to get yourself there.
Exactly. You've got to conquer those anxiety and those...
Did she go with you on the bus?
No. And I spilled Coke all down my trousers. It looked like I wet myself, and it was probably the worst bus journey I had. But after that, it couldn't get any worse.
Yeah.
So I could get the bus quite confidently.
No Coke on the bus.
No Coke on the bus, obviously. but yeah, and it's okay for me because obviously I was able to do that. But as we both know, you meet one autistic person, you meet one autistic person, and there are some autistic people that wouldn't be able to do that without, say, that mentorship.
Yeah.
So I think it's really key. But I think through the progress, it's then when they go into a job, they might necessarily not know how to act or how to come across, how to dress. I remember my first interview, I went in a checkered shirt and chinos, and everyone else was in a suit because it was an apprenticeship scheme that I ended up, and I think they're really handy as well.
I agree, actually, I agree. So that allows you to learn in quite a kind of gradual way, building skills, building confidence. I mean, that's what apprenticeships are about, really.
And I think you get the support as well during that time. You know, it's not, like, for me, I look at school, and sometimes when someone is struggling, I think educationally, and their special educational needs, I sort of ask myself the question, and I ask this to teachers, is the child happy? And if the answer is yes, sometimes, I know education is really important, but if the kid's happy and they're in an environment where, you know what, they could, one year they might be doing really bad at English, but next year they might really take an interest in music and just go all the way with it. But if that kid's happy, does it actually 100% matter if they're not getting the A's or the B's or the C's that they should be getting? Yeah, because I interviewed my mum for the Autism Connections as well, and my mum said to me, qualifications was the least of my worries. Getting you through life was my priority. So, I mean, what are your thoughts? Because I obviously always encourage education because I think it gives you that extra step that you need to in life. And obviously it's so important for our generation to have the correct education and know things. But do you think the happiness and welfare of a special educational needs child or a child in general should always outweigh the education?
I'm not sure I'd sort of balance one off against the other, but one of the points I think you have made that I think is really important with special educational needs is that the getting through life point, actually managing the practical skills, you know, because things can be much more of a challenge. The process of getting to work can be a challenge, the process of presenting yourself right, engaging correctly with your colleagues, being reliable, timekeeping, trustworthy, maintaining a good standard of discipline. That stuff isn't really part of school, but it is part of operating effectively within a team, in a workplace, whatever your job.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes, well, then definitely the practical side is something that does not come as naturally to quite a lot of children with special educational needs, including autism. And if that can be mastered, I think that is a huge advantage. And I think the opposite is true as well. If it's never mastered, I think the autistic child will face a permanent handicap in the workplace.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And I think as well, what you said earlier was really key about a lot of autistic people obviously protected under the Equality Act. And obviously, you know, my experience of that happening. But what I found was, obviously I was quite able to look it up, make sure that I knew where I stood. And I sometimes think, well, I knew a parent whose son was working and they wasn't treating him very right. But it's that not having that knowledge of, okay, autism is protected under this and they shouldn't be doing this because X, Y and Z. Do you feel that there's enough knowledge for people around the law for them to know, okay, even though, for instance, you're in probation, it doesn't matter.
You're protected in law, yeah, so that's a good point. So just 2 points I'd make on that. I think that knowing, from an employer point of view, knowing the Equality Act is one thing, but that tends to be, you know, once you're engaging that, normally something's gone a bit wrong, like have we been managing this person correctly? So what you really want is the employer who has the more open-minded method of employing in the first place, is more conscious of neurodiversity within the workplace, it actually helps, I think, if an employer is supportive, that they know if they have an autistic member of staff, because they know they can make reasonable adjustments, they have an obligation to do so under the Equality Act, but that it's part of the way they operate their workplace anyway. In my experience, it still varies quite a lot from employer to employer. And I would still say, if I was being brutally honest, that probably most employers are not that aware of neurodiversity. Some, but I don't think it's that advanced in the majority of workplaces. Would that be something that the National Autistic Society would agree with?
I think they would. I think when they done the survey, I think, I can't remember the exact statistic, but I think it was around 90% employers admitted that they wouldn't hire someone with autism because they wouldn't know how to support them.
That's unlawful in itself, actually, but yeah.
Yeah, because you
can't discriminate. Yeah, exactly. But again,
but it's valuable data, you know, especially for us.
It is valuable data because it's also the fact that the employer isn't saying no. They're generally not saying no because they're mean-spirited. They're saying no because they think they're being asked to manage something that is beyond them.
Yeah.
And that involves dispelling a few myths, but also it probably involves a more realistic assessment about what jobs could involve, how you might accommodate people in the workplace. Actually, it's often much more possible. I do think the workplace is changing. I can think of employers here that I've spoken to who do have policies and procedures in place to encourage neurodiversity. So I don't want to be critical because I do think this environment is evolving, exactly. But I still think we're sort of more behind than advanced, basically. Yeah. We've got a long way to go.
I remember when the Autism Act came in, I believe it was 2009.
Yeah, and a really important piece of legislation.
And I think it was Cheryl Gillian who sadly passed away. You know, she was a real...
Of course, she was a champion on this. It was one of her big parts of her legacy.
Yeah, and you know, the last series of this, when I heard the news, I made sure it was dedicated to her. You know, I had the honour of meeting her up in Parliament.
Good.
Always felt she listened, always felt engaged, and I feel the same with yourself. You know, when I've done things and I've worked raising the awareness through the Diana Award or the Coronavirus Leader of the Year, you know, I've received letters from you. Obviously, we've spoken online.
We have.
So, you know, I always thank you for
No, it's my pleasure. It's something I am interested in, and as I say, it does get raised with me by parents in West Berkshire, the battles that they're having, and honestly,
if you ever feel you need a bit of, you know, even if it would help the people who get in contact with you, you know, we've got an autistic person on board who would love to talk to you if it would help. That offer is always on the table.
It's a very
as well.
kind offer, thank you.
Because yeah, you know, I want to support as many people that I can throughout, I suppose, my process of life, and continue doing that. So with all that being said, in terms of autism at the moment, where would you ideally like to see it, let's say, in the next 10 years? You know, what things do you think government could put in place to help education, employment, and obviously benefits as well? Because I know so many stories of people that have, I mean, this is myself included, but when it changed to personal independent payment from I can't remember what the old one was called, but it turned into PIP. I know so many people that were, including myself, who went for the assessment, and the person who was assessing us was not like trained in autism or anything, and then they get declined their personal independent payment. I was actually declined because, this was on the form, because I was well dressed and well nourished.
Yeah,
but,
I've heard this before.
Yeah.
So this is what I think the measure of success will be. I think the participation of autistic people in the labour market, in other words, in full or part-time employment, will be the big indicator of the next 10 years. As I've said, on a practical, local level, but it probably applies nationally, I think we should have diagnostic tools available in schools. There are some pilots planned for that, but I think it would really help to get children who are autistic diagnosed as early as possible, and it's not the experience of far too many people around here. I think the other indicator that's really, really important, and I hope this will change in 10 years, have changed in 10 years' time, is how many autistic people there are in the prison system, in the criminal justice system, because they're overrepresented relatively to how many people they are in the population, and I think that is a sign of how we're failing autistic people at the moment. And you know how that comes about, because it comes about because they don't succeed in school, or they don't even complete school. Then rather than having the tools to get into work, they don't get into work, and it's very quick from there to go into a pathway that leads you into a life of crime. And the truth is, the prison system can never really deal with that, because first of all, it's not really their role. And actually we don't have any accurate data, and people don't have to submit to an autism diagnostic thing when they go to prison. There's no obligation to, and lots of people would say no anyway. But I know that it is a fact that autism is overrepresented on the prison estate, and I think that is a really, really lamentable thing. And so I hope that we'll see in 10 years' time far better representation of autism in the workplace, and far less representation of autism on the prison estate.
So last question then.
Yes.
So you mentioned about the pilots coming up for schools, being able to diagnose. Do you know of any other things that the government are going to be doing?
So I think that the critical next step for autism really is the Special Educational Needs White Paper, which is basically the government setting out what it plans to do. And I think I can probably say fairly that it has been heavily delayed. And I think the pandemic has played a part, but I know that campaigners, they frequently write to me saying they were expecting it last year and it didn't come, so we're expecting it this year. And that will be an important moment actually for autism and other special educational needs, because it will set out in detail what the government is going to do to improve that. So I think that is the next sort of important landmark on the autism journey.
Well, no, honestly, thank you ever so much for taking the time and talking to me. So thank you, Laura.
Nice to see you.